Thanks much, Stefan. So thanks for inviting me. It's very nice to be giving a talk in person. So I'm going to be talking about this phenomenon which goes under the name the acquaintance inference or the acquaintance requirement. So the basic observation is that utterances of simple sentences containing a predicate of taste typically give rise to an acquaintance inference. That is, they typically convey that the speakers had a certain sort of first-hand experience with the item of predication. So for example, if I said something like, the crème caramel is delicious, that would typically convey that I'd tasted the crème caramel, but I wasn't just basing my judgment on the testimony of someone else. Or if I said, traveling with Mary is fun, that would usually suggest that I had in fact traveled with Mary. Or if I said, that movie is frightening, that would again suggest that I'd actually seen the movie and wasn't just basing my remark on the say-so of others or having read the reviews or something. So in the case of a predicate of gustatory taste like delicious, which I'll mostly just use a focus on here for simplicity. So for example, if I'd not tasted the crème caramel but had merely heard that it was good, it would, for example, be better to hedge and to say something like, apparently the crème caramel is delicious, or I've heard that it's delicious. Maybe in the right context, I could even say, it must have been delicious. Everybody was raving about it, something like that. So it's the flat-out assertion that seems marked, or seems marked if I haven't had the relevant experience. So taste predications contrast here with more factual predications. So for example, if I were to say, the crème caramel contains gluten, for example, you wouldn't necessarily reach any very specific conclusion about the grounds for my assertion. So I will immediately add, though, that the inference is a default inference, and it doesn't always arise, even with relatively simple taste sentences. And there are potentially various sources of diffeasibility. But one source arises with what are called exocentric uses of taste predicates. So typically, when you use a taste predicate, the sort of standard usage is you're using it to convey something about your own tastes and sensibilities. And that's what people in the literature call autocentric uses. But sometimes you might use a taste predicate to say something about someone else's tastes and sensibilities, and that's what's called an exocentric use. So to give you an example of an exocentric use, consider this little dialogue. So A says, how is Mary's trip to Morocco going? And B replies by saying, it's great. Food is delicious. She's met a lot of interesting people, and she loves the beaches. So B's remark there, so B says the food is delicious, but that obviously doesn't suggest the speaker has tasted the food in Morocco. But it would suggest maybe that Mary, well, I mean, there's also a strong contextual inference there that Mary has tasted the food in Morocco. She probably didn't just like bring all her own food with her and something like that. But so there's not a speaker acquaintance inference there, but there still might be an acquaintance inference where the acquaintance is now tracking the relevant judge, which in this case is Mary, not the speaker. There may be other sources of defeasibility, and there also seems to be some speaker variation in how easily defeated the inference is. For simplicity, I'm mostly going to set exocentric readings aside here along with other sources of defeasibility. Because what I'm mostly going to be interested in is what happens when you take a simple taste sentence or an atomic taste sentence and you embed it in a larger linguistic structure and then examine sort of what the default reading is. So, but the sort of basic question I'm interested in is why does the acquaintance inference arise at all? So one way to think about it is, there are lots of different ways to get information about the world. Right? So there's direct perception, memory, testimony, right? And normally, roughly speaking, within limits for like empirical information, you can kind of get that information any way you want, and then you're in a position just to make an assertion if your evidence is sufficiently strong. So what's interesting about this is that it looks like there's some kind of restriction on the source of information, or there's a kind of default expectation about what the source of information will be, that it'll be sort of first-hand experience. Okay, so why does this inference arise with respect to taste predicates? So one, I think, kind of at least initially attractive answer is a kind of expressivist answer. So it would say something like this. Well, simple taste sentences, they're not merely vehicles for stating facts about the world, but for expressing our reactions to experiences we've had. So when you taste the crème caramel and you like it, you're in a certain psychological state, a state that you could report by saying, I like the taste of the crème caramel. So perhaps when you sincerely say the crème caramel is delicious, you're not reporting that you're in that state, but you're expressing that psychological state. So you're expressing your liking of the taste of the crème caramel. Just like when I say, it's raining, I express my belief that it's raining, I don't report that I believe it. So if that were correct, that would seem to explain why the acquaintance inference arises. For it would seem that you can only be said to like the taste of something if you've actually tasted it. So you can only be in this state, the state of liking the taste of the crème caramel, if you've actually tasted it. So this idea is a form of what philosophers call expressivism about taste predicates, for it maintains that in saying the crème caramel is delicious, one is expressing a certain kind of psychological state, and that state is not a belief. And moreover, the psychological state one is expressing doesn't seem to be one that can be assessed for truth or falsity. Right? So take this state of liking the crème caramel, what is it for that state to be true? What is it for that state to be false? Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to come back to expressivism shortly, but I want to start by considering an alternative view and argue that it faces at least two problems. And then I'll present an expressivist theory that I think avoids these problems and that has various other virtues as well. And I think a particularly interesting feature of this theory is its treatment of taste predicates in the scope of quantifiers, something that hasn't been discussed much in the extant literature. And so the theory I'm going to express, just to foreshadow a little bit, consists of two main parts. One is going to be a recursive definition of satisfaction at a point, so kind of recursive semantics. And then to go with that, an account of assertion. And I'm going to call it a lightweight version of expressivism because it turns out to be compatible with a wide range of accounts of truth and content, such as contextualism, relativism, and purer forms of expressivism. So I'll explain what I mean by that. That might sound a little confusing at first, but we'll come to that. So I want to start off by talking about a view that I sort of held or entertained previously when I first started thinking about this topic, which I'll call the epistemic view. And then I'll argue that this view faces some problems that can be overcome by going to this expressivist view. So the epistemic view basically consists of two things. One is what in the philosophical literature people have been calling the norm of assertion or the knowledge norm. But you can also think of it as just one way of formulating Grice's maximum quality. So this says you can assert phi only if you know it. So in general, we're not supposed to just go around baselessly asserting things, right? You have to at least have evidence for what you assert. There's a question about exactly what epistemic relation you must stand in to a proposition in order to assert it. And the knowledge account says, well, that epistemic relation is knowledge. So on this view, if a speaker asserts phi, that's going to imply that the speaker knows phi. By imply, I don't mean entail. I just mean something like conveys the information meant. So if you assert phi, you're going to be assumed to be attempting to conform to this norm. If you do conform to the norm, then you will know phi. The second part of the epistemic view is a principle in the epistemology of taste, a kind of non-obvious principle, which I call the acquaintance principle. It says, well, you know whether O is delicious is true only if you've tasted O. And I took this from a work in sort of more aesthetics from Richard Wollheim. And basically, so notice that it says if you know whether. So this implies two things, that if you know that O is delicious, that implies that you've tasted O. And also, if you know that O is not delicious, that implies that you've tasted O. So one thing this predicts immediately, just basically because it's like built into the acquaintance principle, is that the acquaintance inference projects over negation, like a standard presupposition, for example. So if I say the crème caramel is delicious, that seems to suggest that I've tasted the crème caramel. But also if I say the crème caramel is not delicious, it's too sweet, that again seems to suggest that I've tasted the crème caramel. And the epistemic view predicts this in a pretty straightforward manner. So suppose you say O is delicious, by the knowledge norm that implicates that you know this. So by the acquaintance principle, it follows that you've tasted O. And similarly, if you say that O is not delicious. When I was first thinking about this, I had a few arguments for this. One thing that impressed me, though, was this next piece of evidence, which is that the inference just disappears when you put it in the scope of epistemic modals and in the antecedents of conditionals. And I won't go through this data, but that's one reason for thinking it's not a standard presupposition, because standard presuppositions typically project out of those environments. But here it just seems to disappear. So look at A, the crème caramel must have been delicious. That doesn't suggest that I've tasted it before. The crème caramel might have been delicious. Again, that doesn't suggest that I've tasted it before. Similarly, if the crème caramel was delicious, Bina will be pleased. Doesn't suggest that I've tasted it before. And this would be entirely expected if, so on the epistemic view, the acquaintance inference is essentially a quality implicature. It's an implicature generated by the manner of the maximum quality. And so think about it, in a way, on this view, the relationship between the crème caramel is delicious and I've tasted it is like the relationship between it's raining and I know whether it's raining. Okay? So that quality implicature also, of course, just disappears in the context of these epistemic modal statements, right? So if I say it must have rained last night, that doesn't suggest that I know that it rained last night. That one's a little controversial because some people think must is factive. But putting that aside, if I say it might have rained last night, it's pretty clear that that doesn't implicate that I know that it rained last night. Similarly with the conditional. So that pattern sort of impressed me. So various people have argued against this account, and there are various interesting arguments. I'm just going to raise two problems for it, because the problems I'm interested in are problems that kind of concern this issue about projection, and that's kind of the thing I'm focusing on here. So the first problem concerns disjunction. So Fabrizio Cariani, in a forthcoming book, he suggests that if you have a disjunction of taste sentences, that'll often give rise to a disjunction of acquaintance requirements. So so it's kind of hard actually to get disjunctions of atomic taste sentences, but you can get them if you set up the context. So here's an example. So suppose A has just arrived at the party. She and B are looking at the dessert table. And A asks, what's good here? And B says, either the crème caramel is delicious or the panna cotta is. I couldn't tell which was which. So this suggests that B has either tasted the crème caramel or B has tasted the panna cotta. She's tasted one of them. Okay, so you have this disjunction of these atomic taste sentences. They seem to implicate this kind of disjunctive acquaintance inference. And then you can ask, well, what does the epistemic view predict about this? Well, if you utter the disjunction, right, the knowledge norm will say, well, you know that disjunction. I mean, assuming everything is going perfectly, right? So if I utter that disjunction, I'll implicate that I know it. But now we're just kind of stuck, because the acquaintance principle really only concerns atomic taste sentences and their negation. Right? It just doesn't say anything about what it is to know a disjunction of taste sentences. So it's not. So the objection here isn't really like, it's obviously not a refutation, it's just that there's something we want predicted and it doesn't issue the prediction. So there's a question about whether you could supplement this view with further principles to see if you could generate the prediction. I'll come back to that. Let me just go on to the second problem, which is kind of similar. So this is another observation. So it seems like quantified taste claims give rise to various quantified acquaintance requirements. So if I say, for example, something on the dessert table is delicious, that would normally suggest that the speaker has tasted something on the dessert table. Similarly, if I say everything on the dessert table is delicious, that might suggest that I've tasted everything on the dessert table. Again, and I'll come back and talk, there's some more interesting data involving quantifiers, but that's just a sampling. But that's enough, I think, already to cause a problem for the epistemic view, because again, the epistemic view doesn't predict these observations. So just consider the existential quantifier. So I assert something on the dessert table is delicious. So the knowledge norm tells us, well, that implicates that I know that something on the dessert table is delicious. But again, AP, the acquaintance principle, simply says nothing about what is involved in knowing that something on the dessert table is delicious. So the basic problem, again, is just that the acquaintance principle only concerns atomic taste sentences and their negations. So as I pointed out, you could ask, well, could the epistemic view be supplemented by further principles that would yield the right predictions in these cases? So perhaps that might be possible, and I think there are like a few moves you can make here, but I feel like that it doesn't go very far. So I don't quite see how to do it myself. Though it's kind of it's an interesting question. It's still open in my mind. But there are other objections to this view that other people have given, which also might worry you. So some people think, even if I haven't tasted the crème caramel, there are certainly contexts in which I can say that I know that it's delicious. So an example would be, I don't know, I'm not feeling well, I'm at this party, and everybody keeps coming by and telling me to try the crème caramel. They keep saying, taste the crème caramel, it's delicious, and I'm getting sick of this. And finally I say, look, I know it's delicious, and I don't feel well. Okay, so that seems okay. Maybe that's a special context. Maybe the default thing is if I say, I know it's delicious, that suggests that I've tasted it. That's kind of a subtle issue. But there are other kind of worries in that vein, I think. Okay, so let me move on to this view that I want to advocate for today. So it's what I'm going to call lightweight expressivism. So as I said before, there are two parts. One is kind of a recursive semantics, and then there's an account of assertion. So I'm going to start by building up to the recursive semantics. But to do that, I need to put in place a few notions that the semantics is going to appeal to. So assume a domain D of individuals, a non-empty domain, and a set of worlds W. So I'm just going to stipulate or define the notion of a standard of taste as a possibly partial function from the domain into 0, 1. And the idea is that if f is a standard of taste, and it maps an object O to 1, then it's like evaluating that positively. So it's tasty according to the standard. And if it maps it to 0, it's not tasty according to the standard. So it's either the standard is indifferent about it or it doesn't like it. So that's just a kind of abstract definition of a standard of taste. But then for any individual J in world W, I'm going to talk about J's categorical standard of taste in W, chi Wj. So this, and I will not, it gets a little exhausting to keep saying chi Wj, so sometimes I'll just pronounce that as chi. So chi maps O to 1 if J has tasted O and liked it in W. Chi maps an object O to 0 if J has tasted O and did not like it in W. And chi is undefined for O if J hasn't tasted O and W. So that's why it's the categorical standard. Okay, so it doesn't care about your dispositions to enjoy things. It only cares about when you tasted and liked, or tasted and didn't like. So just to give you a two example, so suppose we have a domain that consists of just the 3 items on the dessert table: the crème caramel, the panna cotta, and the apple tart. So suppose you, J, in the actual world W, like the crème caramel, dislike the panna cotta, and you haven't tried the apple tart, then your categorical standard of taste, chi, maps the crème caramel to 1, maps the panna cotta to 0, and is not defined for the apple tart. So the apple tart is just not in the domain of that function. Okay, now some more definitions. So, so we have the notion of a generator. So a generator is a total function from pair to wj. So wj, that's a world individual pair, a centered world. So it's a function from centered worlds to standards of taste. So for example, chi is a generator that maps wj to chi wj, j's categorical standard of taste in W. So it just goes to all the world individual pairs and returns the categorical standard of taste for that individual in that world. Now, a generator sigma is complete if and only if sigma for all wj, sigma maps wj to a total function. So chi, for example, is not a complete generator on the intended interpretation because, like you here in the actual world haven't tasted the apple tart. Okay, so your categorical standard of taste is not defined for certain objects in the domain. Now, a crucial notion that I'm going to make use of is a complete extension of chi. So a generator sigma is a complete extension of chi if and only if sigma is complete, and for all wj and all objects O in the domain, if chi is defined for O, then sigma agrees with chi on O. So sigma and chi are these generators. So if sigma is a complete extension of chi, I'm also going to say that sigma wj is a complete extension of chi wj. So let's say, let me give you an example. So you go back to our toy example. There are 3 things on the dessert table. You've tried 2 of them. Since you, J, have only tried 2 of the things in the domain in the actual world, there are 2 complete extensions of your categorical standard of taste, right? So you've tried the crème caramel and the panna cotta. So the 2 extensions I'm going to call sigma 0 and sigma 1. So they both are going to agree with your categorical standard of taste on the crème caramel and the panna cotta because you've tried those. Since you haven't tried the apple tart, these 2 extensions are going to disagree on that. Right? So one of them is going to map the apple tart to 0, and the other one is going to map the apple tart to 1. So what these complete extensions do, right, is they're just extensions of your, you have a partial function, this categorical standard, and these complete extensions are just ways of extending that function to a total function. Okay. So of course, this toy example, right, there's only one thing you haven't tasted, so there are only 2 complete extensions. But if there are lots of things in the domain that you haven't tasted, there'll be lots of complete extensions. But one way to kind of, that is useful when you're trying to think about this is, there are actually only 2 that really matter, that you usually need to think about, which is what we might call the picky extension, which takes everything you haven't tasted and maps it to 0. So it doesn't like anything you haven't tasted. And then there's the easy to please extension, which takes everything you haven't tasted and maps it to 1. So most of the time, if you're trying to think about this, what's going on here, just try to think about one of those 2 extensions. Okay, so let me try to give you the basic idea behind this account. So the idea is that you could say A is delicious. That's assertable if and only if every complete extension of your categorical standard maps A to 1. So what that means is in the example where there are only 3 things on the dessert table and you've tried 2 of them, so since you've tried the crème caramel and you've liked it, right, the 2 complete extensions of your categorical standard will map the crème caramel to 1. So you can say the crème caramel is delicious because both of your complete extensions map the crème caramel to 1. You can't say the panna cotta is delicious because both of the complete extensions of your categorical standard map it to 0. And you also can't say the apple tart is delicious because one of your complete extensions maps the apple tart to 0. Namely, the one that doesn't like anything that it hasn't tried. So to kind of preview, so basically in defining a kind of technical notion of assertability, we're going to be supervaluating over the complete extensions of your categorical standard. So the way I set the semantics up, so I have a formal language with variables, individual constants, predicates, including a distinguished one-place taste predicate T, Boolean connectives, some generalized quantifiers, and an epistemic modal. I don't know, the models, that's pretty standard. So let's say, so important here is the definition of a point of evaluation. So that's going to be a tuple consisting of 4 elements: a world, a judge, which is just an individual in the domain, a complete generator, and a variable assignment G. So the fact that the generator is complete means that the semantics, the recursive definition of satisfaction at a point is just bivalent. So if you look at, this is a definition for the Boolean fragment of satisfaction at a point, and if you look at the second thing there, S2, that's the clause for the taste predicate. So T is tasty is true at a point of evaluation, just in case the standard of taste determined by that point of evaluation maps T to 1. You get the standard of taste determined by the point of evaluation by taking the generator and applying it to the world and the judge in the circumstance of evaluation. And then the clauses for negation and the Boolean connectives are just standard. Okay, now I'm going to define this kind of technical notion of assertability of the context. So let a context C be a tuple consisting of a world, a speaker, a judge, and a variable assignment. So the reason for distinguishing the speaker and the judge is kind of going back to that thing I mentioned at the beginning between exocentric and autocentric readings. So in some contexts, the speaker will be the judge. That's kind of the default. And that's going to be an autocentric context. But when they come apart, then you get an exocentric context. That's not going to play a big role in what follows, but that's why I have 2 individuals there. And then we get this definition of assertability at a context. So a sentence phi is assertable at C. Just in case, for all complete extensions sigma of chi, phi is true at the point that has WC is the world, J sub C is the judge, sigma as the generator parameter, and G sub C is the variable assignment. So that's where this supervaluating over complete extensions is coming in. Okay, so I'll just sort of walk through a couple of predictions and talk about them somewhat informally. So for atomic sentences, right, if you say the crème caramel is delicious, this will imply that you tasted and liked the crème caramel. So again, the reason for that is, well, if you haven't tasted it, right, then it won't be in, so if you haven't tasted the crème caramel, the crème caramel won't be in the domain of your categorical standard. And so there'll be some complete extension of your standard, of your categorical standard, that will map the crème caramel to 0. And so you won't be able to assert it. Now notice that, I should also mention that I'm not giving a definition of truth at a context. So I gave you a recursive definition of satisfaction at a point. And now the supervaluations here are coming in this technical notion of assertability. Okay. So I'll come back and say a bit more about that shortly. Okay, also if you say the crème caramel is not delicious, this will imply that you tasted and didn't like the crème caramel. Again, that's basically for the same reason, because if you haven't tasted it, it won't be in the domain of your categorical standard, so there'll be some extension of your categorical standard that will map that to 0. And you get a similar prediction for conjunction. Now, I'll talk a little bit about disjunction, because that was one of the problems for the epistemic view. So I'll talk about 2 facts about disjunction. So a sentence like either the crème caramel is delicious or the panna cotta is will imply that either you tasted and liked the crème caramel or you tasted and liked the panna cotta. So the disjunction will imply that you tasted at least one of them, but it actually implies something stronger, right? That you tasted and liked at least one of them. So if, for example, you tasted the panna cotta and didn't like it, and you didn't taste the crème caramel, but you're sort of disposed to like it, that's not enough. The disjunction still won't be assertable. Okay, so it's got to be that the one that you tasted is also one that you liked. Okay, to see why this fact about disjunction might hold, so imagine for a second that you haven't tasted A or B. So let's say you haven't tasted the crème caramel or the panna cotta. Well, then some complete extension of your categorical standard will map both of them to 0, namely the one that doesn't like anything it hasn't tried. Right? The one that doesn't like anything that you haven't tried, so to speak. Okay, that one will always map both of those things to 0. So there's some complete extension of your categorical standard that will map both of those things to 0. But, and maybe not that surprisingly, since we're supervaluating in this definition of assertability, you get this other result, which is that instances of excluded middle are always assertable. So, well, in this technical notion. So if I say that either the crème caramel is delicious or it's not, that's not going to imply that I've tasted it. Okay. Why is that? I think that's a good prediction. So why does this predict it? We'll let sigma be any complete extension of your categorical standard. So it will either map the crème caramel to 1 or it will map it to 0. If it maps it to 1, then the sentence, the crème caramel is delicious, will be satisfied at the point of evaluation that includes that complete extension. And so since the atomic sentence is true, is sort of satisfied at that point of evaluation, the disjunction will, because satisfaction at a point is totally classical. Similarly, if on the other hand, an arbitrary complete extension sigma of your categorical standard maps the crème caramel to 0, then the crème caramel is not delicious will be satisfied relative to that complete extension, and so the disjunction will be satisfied relative to that complete extension. Okay, so what I've done is I've given you a recursive semantics for this Boolean fragment, and then I've defined that I've kind of given you this supervaluational definition of a kind of technical notion of assertability, and then maybe like somewhat illegitimately I've drawn conclusions about what that means for what you can assert. I'll come back to that and try to say a bit more about the pragmatics. Oh, actually, I'll do that now. So, also, I haven't really said anything. I called this an expressivist theory of taste predicates, but you might wonder, like, why am I calling it that? So let's just talk about this for a minute. So there's this interesting question that people in the expressivism literature ask, people in the speech acts literature ask too, which is, like, we talk about assertions or speech acts expressing mental states, but what exactly does that mean? So I take it there are different answers one could give to that. I'm going to adopt one that Malta Willer and Chris Kennedy give in a paper also on expressivism about taste predicates. So what they say is that speech acts express states of mind insofar as they require the speaker to be in a certain state of mind for the utterance to be in accordance with the norms for performing that speech act. So suppose, for example, that there's a norm that entails that you may assert phi only if you believe it. Then if you do assert phi, your assertion will ordinarily implicate that you believe it. Or for if I assert phi, my audience will normally assume that I'm attempting to comply with that norm, and if I am complying with it, I will believe phi. So that's one sense in which assertions may be said to express beliefs. I mean, that's kind of I think that's a perfectly fine way of precisifying this talk of expressing mental states. But it's one thing that is a little bit weird about it is it means that, like, if you're lying, you're still expressing the belief. Like, if I tell you that it's raining and I'm lying, I'm still expressing the belief that it's raining. Obviously, not my belief, not my token belief, but in some sense, I'm still expressing the belief that it's raining. That's maybe a little slightly strange feature of this kind of way of understanding what it is to express a mental state. Nevertheless, I think it's a perfectly legitimate way to talk. Okay, so how does this help with taste predicates? So here's how atomic taste sentences might express states of liking. So suppose we had the following assertion norm, which said for any context C, the speaker may assert phi in C only if the speaker believes the content of phi in C, and phi is assertable in C in our technical sense. Right? So we give this technical notion of assertability, but maybe that plays into this sort of general norm of assertion. So suppose that were right. Well, then suppose you assert the sentence, the crème caramel is delicious. So your hearer will assume that you're attempting to comply with this assertion norm. And if you are complying with the assertion norm, then given the first fact we talked about atomic sentences, you will have tasted and liked the crème caramel. Because if you're complying with the assertion norm, then phi will be assertable in the technical sense. The crème caramel is delicious will be assertable in the technical sense. And if it's assertable in that sense, then you will have tasted and liked the crème caramel. So that's one sense in which the crème caramel is delicious can be said to express your liking of the crème caramel. Namely that if you assert the crème caramel is delicious and you're complying with the norm, then your hearer will be able to infer that you like the crème caramel. Okay, so that's for like the atomic case where it's this pretty straightforward mental state of liking, the state I'm in when I like the crème caramel. But we have these more complex states, and that's always usually the problem for expressivism, traditional Frege-Geach problem for expressivism, that it seems like a coherent proposal for atomic sentences, maybe negations, but once you get to logically complex things, it's more complicated. So how does that come out on this approach? Well, we've already looked at disjunction, so let's consider that. So suppose I say either the crème caramel is delicious or the panna cotta is. I couldn't tell which was which. On the present account, if my assertion complies with the assertion norm, then I'll be in a certain complex state. The state one is in when one has either tasted and liked the crème caramel or tasted and liked the panna cotta. So in just the same sense as earlier, when I utter that disjunction, I express this complex state. As I was writing this handout, though, I kind of realized that that state you're in, so this is this complex state, the state you're in when you've either tasted and liked the crème caramel or tasted and liked the panna cotta. From a kind of more natural way of thinking about what mental states are, that itself is not a mental state, right? It's like this disjunctive state that you happen to be in. But I don't know. I don't think that that's. I think that if you're some kind of expressivist, you're going to have to accept that you with logically complex things, you express these complex states of yourself, which aren't themselves necessarily mental states. Okay. So I want to move on and let's see. So what time did we start at? 2:30.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about quantifiers. So I'm assuming just pretty standard clauses for generalized quantifiers. So I've just given entries for some, every, and exactly 2. So they take 2 arguments there. We could include sort of any generalized quantifier that we want, most, none. And this approach yields a couple of interesting results for quantifiers. So one is a general result. So first note that for each generalized quantifier q sub x, there's a corresponding binary relation, q sub r, on subsets of the domain. Right, so some, the relation is non-empty intersection. Every, the relation is subset. Exactly 2, the relation is intersection has cardinality 2. So in terms of that kind of the corresponding binary relation for a given generalized quantifier qx, we get this result. So what this says basically is if you say, if it's assertable for you to say qf's are delicious, then it follows that qf's are such that you tasted and liked them. So if you say q things on the dessert table are delicious, this will imply that q things on the dessert table are such that you tasted and liked them. So for example, if you say something on the dessert table is delicious, this will imply that there's something on the dessert table that you tasted and liked. So that was again one of the problems for the epistemic view, was it didn't say anything about these quantified cases. This view gives you a whole, basically gives you a string of predictions, right? You just give it an entry for a given quantifier. And note again that this prediction is stronger than just there's something on the dessert table that you liked. Or sorry, there's something on the dessert table that you tasted. So it's not enough that you tasted something on the dessert table, didn't like it, but you're disposed to like something else on the table. Right? So the inference is not just you've tasted something on the dessert table, it's that you liked something. So another example would be if I say exactly 2 things on the dessert table are delicious. Suppose there are 10 things there, and I say, I don't know why I'm saying this, maybe think up a context, but I say exactly 2 things on the table are delicious. That's going to imply that exactly 2 things on the table are such that you tasted and liked them. Okay, so that's a general result for quantifiers, but with respect to more specific quantifiers, you get some interesting results, and I'll mention one concerning exactly 2. Partly because it differs a little bit with the way standard presuppositions interact with exactly 2. So here's a fact about what a prediction this amendment makes with respect to exactly 2. So if I say exactly 2 things on the dessert table are delicious, this actually implies that you've tasted everything on the dessert table. Right, because suppose there are 10 things on the dessert table, and so, sorry, I think that is a good prediction. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. I think that's right. But let me explain why it comes out, right? Because suppose there are 10 things on the dessert table, and you've, I don't know, let's say you've tasted 2. Could be any number less than 10. Right? But suppose you've tasted 2. So take one of the things you haven't tasted. So you've tasted 2 things on the dessert table. So let's say you say exactly 2 things are delicious. You've tasted and liked 2 things on the dessert table, but you haven't tasted any of the others. So take the complete extension of your categorical standard that maps everything you haven't tasted to 0. Relative to that complete extension, exactly 2 things on the dessert table are delicious will not be satisfied. Right? So it's not satisfied with respect to every complete extension of your categorical standard. Okay, so the only way to make sure that it's going to be satisfied with respect to every complete extension of your categorical standard is for you to have tasted everything. Okay, so note that our earlier result was that if you say exactly 2 things on the dessert table are delicious, this implies that you've tasted and liked exactly 2 things. Okay, so what you get basically is that if you say exactly 2 things on the dessert table are delicious, means you've tasted, let's say it's, I don't know, it's common ground in the context that there are 10 things, then this will imply that you tasted and liked 2 of them and you tasted and didn't like the other 8. So one of the interesting things about this is that there's a kind of subtle difference here between the behavior of the acquaintance requirement and standard presuppositions. And I'm mentioning this because kind of competitive view, which I haven't talked about, is that the acquaintance requirement really just is a kind of presupposition, but one that behaves in some unusual ways. But one thing that's interesting here is if you take a sentence like, exactly 2 students in my class stopped smoking recently. So stopped is a kind of standard presupposition trigger. So Joe stopped smoking triggers the presupposition that Joe smoked in the past. So I say exactly 2 students in my class stopped smoking recently. So suppose there are 10 students in my class, 2 of whom smoked in the past and no longer smoke, 8 of whom never smoked. So according to B.R. George, who's written about this, that sentence has a reading on which it's true in this situation. Exactly 2 stopped smoking. So, and it's not clear to me actually whether it has this universal presupposition reading, whether it could mean, whether 14 could imply everyone in my class smoked in the past. But anyway, even putting aside the question about whether 14 has another reading, it seems to me that exactly 2 things on the dessert table are delicious. It just doesn't have that reading. It just doesn't have the reading on which it's okay if I tasted and liked exactly 2 things. Okay, so what we've done, so we've given a recursive definition of satisfaction at a point, and we've stated an account of assertion in terms of that. What we haven't done is give an account of the truth of a sentence at a context, or an account of the content expressed by a sentence at a context. And so it turns out that our approach is largely neutral on the main rival approaches to these issues. So let me try to explain this. So we talked about an agent's categorical standard of taste, that's what we've been talking about mostly. But if you just were thinking, what is my notion of an agent's standard of taste? That might be kind of, it's kind of unclear whether that should be defined for things you haven't tasted or not. Maybe in one sense it is, in one sense it's not. So the categorical standard of taste is the one in which it's not. But we can also have this notion of a hypothetical standard of taste. So an agent J's hypothetical standard of taste in world W, delta Wj, that's a total function from the domain to 0, 1. It'll map an object O to 1 if the agent is disposed to like O. It will map it to 0 if the agent is disposed not to like O. And it's a total function, it's defined for everything. And you could assume that your dispositional, your hypothetical standard is an extension of your categorical standard. Or another way to put it is your categorical standard is just a restriction of your hypothetical standard, the thing you actually taste. That idealizes over the fact that maybe you taste something on a given occasion and you're not feeling well, and so you don't like it, even though in some sense you're disposed to like it. Just putting that aside. Okay, so suppose you were so moving to a slightly different debate about taste predicates. So there's this whole other debate about taste predicates, about should we be contextualists about taste predicates, should we be relativists, or something else. So I'm saying that what I've said so far is neutral on this. So contextualism would say, in this framework, would say, well, the content of the proposition expressed by sentence phi to context C is just going to be this set of worlds where the generator parameter is set to delta. So what that means, that's the hypothetical generator. So in this approach, the content of the sentence, the crème caramel is delicious, in an autocentric context, is just the proposition that the speaker is disposed to like the crème caramel. Right, so when you say the crème caramel is delicious, well, I told you that other story about how you're expressing this state, your state of liking the crème caramel. But on this approach, you'd also just be asserting a proposition in a kind of straightforward sense. Just this proposition about your dispositions. I mean, lots of people don't like that kind of account. I'm just showing that you could have it if that's the kind of thing that you think is right. It also illustrates something, which is that it's clear from this contextualist version of expressivism that one is really expressing one's liking of the crème caramel in this theory and not asserting that one likes it. Because suppose, like, you haven't tasted the crème caramel, but you just say, for whatever reason, you just decide to say, the crème caramel is delicious. The contextualist can allow that that's what you said is true, right? It's just that you weren't permitted to assert it because of this story about assertion. That's, I think, another advantage, a kind of conceptual advantage over thinking about this in terms of assertability and expressing mental states than in terms of presupposition. Because at least on the sort of most standard accounts of presupposition, it's done in terms of definedness conditions. So that if the presupposition fails, the sentence is neither true nor false. But it seems a little bit, this is a slight tangent, but conceptually it's a little bit weird to think, to actually think the acquaintance requirement is a presupposition for the following reason, right? So suppose I haven't tasted the crème caramel. Nevertheless, I might believe that it's delicious, right? I might think, well, I can have all these range of attitudes towards the content, the crème caramel is delicious. Attitudes that wouldn't be appropriate if I knew that it was neither true nor false. Right? So if I know, for example, that Joe's never smoked in the past, I don't believe that Joe stopped smoking. Right? So if in the acquaintance requirement case, because you can have these various attitudes towards the underlying proposition, even when the acquaintance requirement fails, it shouldn't be seen as a condition on truth. Okay. And that's what comes through in this contextualist version. So this version of the proposal would count as what people in ethics talk about as hybrid expressivism. So in addition to expressing one's liking of the crème caramel, one would also be expressing a certain belief, for example, the belief that one is disposed to like the crème caramel, and that's just an ordinary belief, one accessible for truth or falsity. Okay, but we're not committed to this contextualism because we could adopt one of these other accounts of content and truth, like relativism, or what I call pure expressivism. Okay, let me just say one last thing. So when I introduced the epistemic view, if you'll recall, I said one of the things I was impressed with when I was thinking about the epistemic view was that the acquaintance requirement just sort of disappeared in the epistemic modal context. Right, so when I say the crème caramel might be delicious, that doesn't suggest at all that I've tasted it. And if anything, it suggests that I haven't tasted it. And quality implicatures also disappear in those contexts. That seems promising there. So what should we say about that? So we can give an account of this. It's not, I don't know, it's not the most elegant or explanatory account, but it will work. So the idea is actually from a paper by Pranav Anand and Natasha Korkova. They give a presuppositional account of taste predicates. And their idea is that what happens in these contexts is that the relevant operator, like the epistemic modal, will obviate the acquaintance requirement by shifting some parameter. So in this case, it shifts the generator parameter sigma to delta, the generator that maps each centered world to the hypothetical standard of that centered world. So for example, if you look at on this last page of the handout, S9, this clause for must, the thing I want to just observe there is it's a very standard clause for epistemic must, just a relational modal, but it also shifts that parameter sigma to delta. And so what that basically means is if I say the cake must be delicious on this account, that will imply that it follows from what is known that you were disposed to like the cake. So that can be true even if you've never tasted the cake. Okay, so it gets obviated just by the lexical semantics of this operator. Okay, so that's all I had to say. So just to recap the components of that account. So there's this recursive account of, there's just this pretty straightforward recursive semantics, actually, or recursive definition of satisfaction at a point. That's linked up to an account of assertion, which yields predictions about the assertability of these sentences. And I tried to keep that separate from issues about truth and content for the sort of conceptual reasons I was talking about earlier. And that, I didn't go in to talk about this presupposition, this kind of a view on which the acquaintance requirement is a presupposition, but that sort of came up at various points, and I tried to give various little hints of arguments for why I don't think it's a presupposition. But that conceptual point, I think, is maybe the most important one. Okay, thanks a lot.